So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much indeed for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here, and fantastic weather down in Northamptonshire compared to Newcastle, where it was a bit colder yesterday, although I'm told tomorrow we should even things out. So it's a particular pleasure to speak to you, in part because the first grant I ever received to go to the US and work with Professor John Voorhees, who amazingly is still chair of the department in Ann Arbor, and that was supported by the Psoriasis Association. And that really started my kind of clinical and research interests in psoriasis that have gone ever since. And we moved back from Ann Arbor to Newcastle in the early 90s, and I've been there ever since. So initially as a trainee, and then more recently as a professor since 2001. So Newcastle is famous for many things, including the Royal Victoria Infirmary, although we are told that Queen Victoria wasn't terribly enamoured with Newcastle, and whenever she came through on the train from Balmoral, insisted the blinds were put down. So she didn't have to look on to the city, and the reason for that apparently was they ran a dinner at the station hotel shortly after the station was opened, and she was invited as a guest. But someone made an admin error, and the treasurer sent the bill to Buckingham Palace. So that didn't go down. So she was not amused. No. So that's about Newcastle. And then I'm really speaking on behalf of this whole consortium. And I think this is a very exciting time in psoriasis research. And we're very privileged to have got one of these large MRC grants, which really brings together all kinds of people. There's about 40 people working on this project, lots of universities, hospitals that are listed there. The Psoriasis Association, I'm delighted to say, has been involved from the beginning, and as I'll try and illustrate, was instrumental in helping us get the grant. And I think you discussed this issue a couple of years ago at your AGM. So there's lots of things involved, and it's also importantly industry have come in, not only with expertise but also with some cash. So it really is a collaborative environment. And I think the program we've set out is pretty ambitious, and I'll try and illustrate some areas to you today about what we're trying to achieve and what we've got done so far. So this all comes back to the idea, and we've heard a bit about it already, about personalisation of therapy, whether that be exercise or drugs or UV. And I think it's fair to say, and certainly talking to patients and colleagues today here, that whether a particular therapy works for an individual, unfortunately, is pretty unpredictable. And it really is a question of trying one, see how you get on. If you don't do well with that, move on to the other one. And so the MRC has defined stratified or personalised medicine as the right therapy for the right patient at the right time. So that's a very important concept that we're trying to move towards. And as well as being effective or not, is also a question of whether you develop side effects. So about 10 years ago, we were working on a drug called Differential. Some of you may still be using it. But this illustrates how things were then, and some things have changed and some things haven't. So do you want to just play that for me, please? Thank you.
Scientists at Newcastle University say they've made a significant breakthrough in the treatment of the skin disease, psoriasis. It's a horrible condition which affects about 2% of the population. People have to endure their skin itching and blistering in the most infuriating way. Now, though, hopefully, a breakthrough. At Newcastle, they've worked out why a frequently used ointment eases the condition, and they say their findings could help develop better treatments in the future. Here's Jim Knight.
Since he was 9 years old, John Young from Newcastle has battled with psoriasis. It's not painful, but it itches like mad. It causes his skin to flake, and when it's at its height, John admits he can end up looking a rather unsightly mess.
Oh, it's devastated. I've covered up. I couldn't go swimming, play sports. People, kids used to try to bully you about it. What's that? Even adults in hospital have actually said, he looks like a leper.
There are some treatments that can be used at home, others only in hospital. Either way, they only bring temporary relief, and if they're not applied properly, they can irritate healthy skin.
The treatment isn't pleasant. You're sort of bandaged up for, every day for 3 to 4 weeks. And just stains your body, stains your clothing.
So I think we all kind of resonate with that patient who I think illustrates well some of the issues, including symptoms about skin disease, which we've talked about already today. And I think, therefore, we do need to try and make treatments as acceptable and as effective as we can. If you think about these things from a kind of clinical research point of view, then it's important to categorize these different kind of responses. So there are clearly treatments that you try and they never work, and we call that primary failure. Then there are some treatments that work for a while and then stop working. And this is an illustration of such a patient. We've already talked about PASI score as a measure of their severity. And this patient was given etanercept, and you can see right at the beginning they showed an excellent response, but quite quickly the response is lost. And probably once that occurs, it's difficult to recapture that response. And we now think, and some of this work we're doing in PSORT, is to figure out if actually they're developing either antibodies to the treatment, and that can result in low levels within the blood. So we're measuring blood levels of the drug as well as the antibodies and correlating that with response. Of course, the other factor that this could be is that the patient has got a trigger here for why their psoriasis is flaring. And if that's the case, and it isn't to do with the fact you've got antibodies, you wouldn't want to stop the drug because it may just recover again. So finding out why people don't do well in the end is actually quite important. And of course, the third main reason that treatments don't work for individual patients is that they develop side effects, and then they stop because of that. So, as I mentioned, we have consulted both with our own individual patients in our hospitals, but I think also through the Psoriasis Association, and we brought to this conference a couple of years ago the concept of would patients be willing to have a test that may include a small biopsy at the beginning of treatment, if that was to inform us about which treatment we should choose that was more likely than another one to benefit them in the longer term. And there was really quite strong support for that concept. And so we built that into our design, as we'll discuss. And I think it is the right time to do this. You may say, well, why haven't people been doing this up until now? Well, the reason is partly that the government, I don't think, has taken psoriasis seriously. So we're very pleased that it has. We're only one of 12 diseases to get, across the whole of medicine, to get such support to do this research. And we've started on biological treatment because they obviously seem to be the more severe end of the spectrum, but also the most costly in terms of the government's budget. So those things together have stacked up to mean it's now the right time to do this research. But we strongly believe that what we learn from this can be applied to other treatments. So the concept and how we understand the disease means that we can then think about using it for more simple treatments. And in addition, by using biological treatments, we've gained quite a lot of understanding about how they work, and that can then lead on to new pathways. And in fact, globally, the investment by drug companies is increasing still in psoriasis research. Some people have said that the market is now flooded with biological therapy and there's no reason to develop new ones. Well, I don't think that's really strongly supported. And so the investment by pharma is still increasing, which obviously we're pleased about. So this is the concept that we've got, I need to try and explain to you today about stratification of response. And if you don't I don't make it clear, can you please let me know so I'll try again another way. But the basic concept is that within a population, and we can discuss here a population of patients with psoriasis, there are different individual subtypes. Those subtypes may associate with response. So this patient with this particular molecular signature is a non-responder to a particular drug. This patient from the population has got a different molecular signature, and they are a responder to a particular drug. And this other group are predicted to get an adverse reaction from a particular drug. So it means that you can then take a population, separate them, classify them, and then put them into a category that will inform your therapeutic decision-making with your patient. Now, it's unlikely this is going to be 100% accurate, but the idea is that we can improve the choice at the beginning. So these will not be 100% response and non-response, but the idea is that they will aid the decisions that you're making with your doctor about what you want to do next. And as I've said, currently we do things sequentially. So you may try first methotrexate. If methotrexate doesn't work, you may try acitretin. If that doesn't work, you may then go on to your first biologic. And which biologic do you choose with your dermatologist? And so the idea is that this gives you not only a category of response and non-response, because most patients are not non-responsive to everything. They're responsive to one drug but not another drug. So this particular patient will respond to drug Y but not to drug X. This patient, on the other hand, will respond to drug X but not Y. And so the idea is that by doing this classification, I've illustrated it here with a molecular signature, but in SORT we believe that the actual will develop an algorithm that will be a combination of perhaps patient age. What age did your psoriasis develop? Do you have psoriatic arthritis? And the molecular signature in your skin. All those factors will be brought together and allow us then to predict the best chance of that particular drug being effective in individual patients. So that is what the grant's about. And obviously, you need to look back on what's going on already, and we think there is a precedent for this, and it's useful to think about it in the context of psoriasis. So I would argue that we are already personalizing medicine. So a good example that I'm going to show you in a minute is that most departments, before you have a course of phototherapy, will test your response to ultraviolet light. They'll do a test on you, see how responsive you are. So that is really personalizing the therapy course to your own skin response. Similarly, as I've already mentioned, you can now, in practice, measure antibodies to the biologics. And as a research tool, you can measure the metabolite of methotrexate, so you can see, are you getting to the right levels? There's some evidence that I'll present in a minute that the particular HLA type, which is a particular genetic subset of people with psoriasis, may respond differently to people who don't have that genetic subtype. And certainly outside of dermatology, there's very clear evidence now that they were genetically predisposed to getting very severe drug reactions where people get red all over and may blister, to drugs like carbamazepine, which is used for epilepsy. So people are now testing population or patients to see if they've got that particular type that would predispose them to getting severe adverse events. And if they are, then they're not going to use that drug, they'll use something else. So UV, we've heard a little bit about it, and we've seen some people, indeed sunbathing outside today. And it's always a bit of an issue for dermatologists, because on the one hand, we advise people to be careful about sun exposure with melanoma risk, and yet we still treat a lot of psoriasis patients with UV. But we can square that circle by the fact that there were reasonably good studies now to show that the risk of having a course of UV is pretty low, and the risk is about the same as going on a sunny holiday to the Mediterranean. And actually, we treat 1,000 patients a year at the RVI with UV, and that equates to more than 25,000 sessions in a UV cabinet. So that really is a lot of UV that we give, and it is pretty effective. So PASI 75 means that you've got a 75 improvement in your psoriasis severity score, which equates to an improvement that's significant in your DLQI and other aspects of your life. And you can see that there's a really profound improvement in PASI. And this is the individual responses, so they start here and go down here, and virtually everybody improves. And I think we still regard UV as being a very valuable treatment. The disappointing thing about UV, as many of you will have found, is it may work very well during the course, but within a few months after stopping, then it's generally come back. But if we were able to predict, A, those who are going to do very well, and B, those who are going to stay clear for longer, then it would be very useful to have such a test. And in any case, when we're giving people UV, we want to give them the most effective course that we can in their treatment, so they're not wasting time coming up to hospital for those UV sessions. And so we do this test on patients when they turn up to the department before they start, and we measure their minimal erythemal dose. In other words, is the dose of UV that will produce just mild redness. So in this patient, it would be this dose. So this is a handheld device. It gives different doses of UV, and we can tell what that one is. And this is illustrated further here. So this is the machine that has a metal grid that attenuates the UV. So it means that in one application, you can deliver high doses and low doses, and you can enable to measure the response. Pardon me. And that's important because actually skin type is actually a poor predictor both of the minimal erythemal dose and also how you do during your course. So you may think, well, if you've got very fair skin, they need a lower dose. Well, in partly that's true, but it's not entirely accurate. And so by measuring it this way, we can determine that dose, and then we give, the first dose that we give in the cabinet is 70% of the MED, which means that you're getting up towards a dose that's going to clear your psoriasis without producing strong sunburn, which is clearly not a good idea. The other important concept about psoriasis, which I've already kind of hinted at, is that psoriasis is now regarded potentially as an umbrella term. And I think we can understand that in part because we see different kinds of psoriasis. I'm sure as patients, and certainly we in the clinic, understand that this patient has got stable plaque psoriasis. This patient's got very inflammatory psoriasis associated with inflammatory arthritis. This patient's got flexural psoriasis, and this patient's got pustular psoriasis, very severe, and we've now found, work in Jonathan Barker's group in London, that there's a particular genetic predisposition to getting this kind of psoriasis. So it means that different genes are likely to underlie these different kinds of psoriasis, and therefore potentially their response, because we know that routine treatments don't work very well for pustular psoriasis. So we have to think of something else. But even in the plaque psoriasis, that is the commonest kind, we believe there are these different subtypes that may underlie it. And in part we think that because there's now 20 genetic different loci that predispose to this kind of psoriasis. So the idea is, underneath this umbrella diagnosis of psoriasis, there may be these different groups that we have to kind of tease out, and then that would allow us to predict response, non-response, adverse events, and so personalize our treatment for patients. And as I said, there is a hint that this is already going on. So CW6 is a particular marker in the HLA. HLA is a very important genetic locus that kind of controls your immune responses to lots of things. And this particular marker is the commonest one associated with psoriasis. If you've got that, you're 20 times more likely to get psoriasis. And not only that, but it associates with a particular subgroup. So there's an idea that's been around for many years that there were two main peaks of psoriasis in terms of age. One is late teens, early 20s, and the other is much later in the 50s. And you can see that in part on this graph. And what the important point is that the HLA-CW6 positive, which are in the white bars, tend to associate with early psoriasis, whereas those that don't have that marker tend to develop it later. This isn't an absolute thing, but there's a tendency that that's the case, and that's been confirmed in many studies. And in addition, these patients tend to be predisposed to getting, for example, guttate psoriasis, which is when you have a flare if you have a streptococcal sore throat, and then you get those very tiny bits of psoriasis occurring as a result of that immune stimulus. And so people have now started to look to see whether this genetic marker may predict response to different treatments. And this is very early, and we're trying to replicate this at the moment in our SORT consortium. But there is a hint that ustekinumab, which, as I mentioned in a second, is one of the newer biological agents, the response to that drug is better if you're CW6 positive than if you're CW6 negative. In other words, 96% of patients with CW6 will show a significant improvement at 12 weeks with this genetic marker. If you don't have that, you've still got a 65% chance of responding, but it isn't as good as 96. So at the moment, you'd say, well, I still want to have my ustekinumab because I've got a 65% chance of getting better. But if there was another marker that we hope to discover that switched it round and another drug you had 95% chance, then you may choose that other drug first. And that's shown here on a graph. So you can see right from the beginning, the CW6 people are responding much better. And it isn't just at this one particular level of PASI response. PASI 90 means virtually clear, and they're getting virtually clear more often and quicker than those who don't have that genetic marker. So there's no doubt that biological therapy has revolutionized treatment. This is one of the first patients we treated with infliximab in the RVI, and his psoriasis improved very quickly and dramatically, and he's the only patient we've still got on infliximab now. Everyone else has come off, but he has been absolutely transformed by this kind of response. Just to briefly go through the different kinds of biologics that are available, because this is relevant to the research that we're currently doing with SORT. There were there are a number of different classes. There are those that focus on antibodies or receptors that target TNF, which is tumor necrosis factor. And I'll explain a little bit in a second by why that is important. And there were two antibodies, adalimumab and infliximab, and a receptor, etanercept. The other drug that's been widely used is ustekinumab, which targets other cytokines called IL-12/23. And then more recently, just come on to the market last year, is secukinumab, which targets IL-17A. And a number of these drugs, importantly, are also effective for psoriatic arthritis, so we're treating both elements of the disease oftentimes with these drugs. And I've already mentioned that it has been transformational, but there are these issues that people come off it for both primary, secondary failure and side effects. And there's no doubt as well that people's expectation has been reset. So having had pretty awful psoriasis for a while, then being cleared, you can imagine everyone wants to remain in that clear state. And so that's something that we often discuss with patients, quite understandably. They want to be clear again. How can we help them get to that point? The other element that builds into this is, I'm sure you've heard of this before, called the Koebner phenomenon. And this is where if you get an injury on your skin or a scar, you may develop psoriasis in that area. So this patient had an injury, a blunt injury like a scratch, and in that area he's developed psoriasis. So that shows that the skin is intimately involved in the psoriasis, and it isn't just the immune system itself. So I'm afraid you have to have a pathway slide now to try and help you figure out why we're targeting these different molecules. Again, if it's not clear, please let me know. But the idea is that psoriasis is now regarded as a interaction between the skin, what's called the innate immune system, which is the immune system that's primed to react very quickly in a really non-specific way, and then the acquired immune system, which is designed to be very specific in how it targets particular bacteria or viruses. And all three are thought to go wrong in psoriasis. So if we take injury as the starting point, that can release actually into the system DNA, and that is taken up by antigen-presenting cells that trigger the immune system, the T cells, to produce their cytokines. So in a sense, they're overreacting to a stimulus and trying to deal with, if you like, an adverse event hitting the skin, but they've got it wrong, it's misdirected, and rather than trying to fight off bacteria and viruses, it's actually hitting the skin and causing the psoriasis. The key thing, though, is that in the skin, there are these molecules, TNF, which is part of the innate immune system, IL-17 and IL-23, that are part of the acquired immune system, that the antibodies are blocking and preventing their inflammatory effects and to cause the abnormal growth of the plaque and the scaling and the symptoms of itchiness and soreness. So this is an amplification circuit. It gets kind of misfired and it keeps going unless we intervene to stop it. And the way that we're trying to stop it for this particular context is to use antibodies against these molecules. Okay, so before we get on to what we're doing with the biology, the other important thing that I think and formed the basis of how we got to get funded for SORT was our registry, Bad Beer. And again, lots of patients, hospitals have supported this. And I think we're now regarded as having the best registry in the world in terms of figuring out how people respond to both systemic and biological drugs. And we're already learning quite a lot from this on its own. But there were now 10,000 patients, 12,000 patients recruited into this registry. We've got very detailed data on all of those patients, and they're followed up for up to 5 years. The main aim of the study was to report on side effects. So, in other words, if you go onto one of the biologics, so you're more likely to get infections than if you go onto another one. And we've got some of those answers now. But we also looked how well people did on individual biologics. Was a particular biologic suiting them better or not? And this is the first data that's come out of that and does show, this is the population as a whole, that not everyone responds the same to the drugs. So this is what's called a survival curve. And it's a very simple measure that we used to determine whether a drug was being effective. And that was, is a patient still taking it? Because if a patient's still taking a drug at 3 years, it's likely to be effective. Otherwise, they'd have asked the dermatologist to switch, okay? And there's a number of reasons that we can perhaps discuss why we chose this measure. It's not a perfect measure because there are other factors that may come into it, such as do you have psoriatic arthritis? But that being said, it's clear that not all the drugs are not the same. So you can see that by far the most successful drug in terms of patients deciding to stay on it, which is a combination of both effectiveness and side effects, is ustekinumab. The next is adalimumab, and then these two at the bottom are very close, are etanercept and infliximab. And these differences are statistically significant. Now, that doesn't mean for you as an individual patient that this is predictable, but what it shows us is across a population of several hundred people, this is what we found. And so, on average, if you're going to see your dermatologist, you may want to take this into account when you discuss with your dermatologist which drug you would like to go on, either as a first choice or as a second choice if you're switching. So, as I said, the choice at the moment is a bit random. There's no doubt that if you've got psoriatic arthritis, we think in general the TNF drugs tend to be more effective, so we'll tend to bring that into the conversation. But there are other factors that also need to be borne in mind. So we come back now to this idea of can we stratify? We've done it as a population. Can we now do it as an individual patient level to be able to help the choice when you go to the clinic? And so rather than drug X and drug Y, we're now going to ask, when you start a biologic, is it better for you to go on to ustekinumab, or is it better for you to go on to etanercept, or is it better for you to go on to adalimumab? So the idea is that through a combination of individual factors and genetic testing, we would reach a point where we can get a test and have a predictability about which is the most likely to be successful. So this led on then to this consortium. And it is, I think, an ambitious project. And we're trying to integrate lots of different pieces of information which is a challenge in many ways, both in terms of collecting that information and analysing it in a way that we can understand and subsequently explain and engage with our patients. So this is the bit where we came to you 2 or 3 years ago and said, would you be prepared to have this kind of test? So this is what we're doing at the start of treatment, 1 week in and 12 weeks into treatment. So the idea is if patients with their dermatologist choose to go on to one of these 2 drugs, we say to them, do you want to take part in this study that will help us design a test to predict, not for you, but for the next generation of patients and maybe you in 5 years' time, which drug is most suited to your individual makeup? And that involves 2 tests, really. One is a punch biopsy from a plaque on the lower back, and the other is a blood test, which we repeat during treatment, not only to measure DNA, but also to determine whether patients are developing antibodies to the drug that they're getting. So those are the sampling times, and it is a demanding study because patients are coming in extra times for the study. We do obviously cover all their expenses, but nevertheless, it does require patient engagement. And so we were worried at the start that people said, no, I'm not interested in helping them with that. There's no way I'm going to have a skin biopsy, and particularly if it's not going to help me. But actually, the take-up has been fantastic around the country. Patients have really engaged with it. And in fact, I had a patient very movingly the other week who said to me that they felt very positively about contributing to this study because something good had come out of their psoriasis. And they felt that by contributing into their research, that was a very positive contributory factor, which I guess is what the Psoriasis Association and we're all about. So, when we've got these samples, we do lots of fancy tests on them. And I'm not going to go through all the details, but apart from saying that these are state-of-the-art tests, they're expensive to do, and that's why we need such a large amount of money to be able to figure it out. And we're not proposing that in the end, a patient in the clinic would have all this sampling done. We're very much focused that the beginning point would be the point where we'd say to a patient in the clinic, would you have a biopsy, would you have a blood test to help us decide which therapy is best suited to you? So we're going to mention these briefly so that you can, I think, understand some of the scale of what we're doing and how that may lead into this discovery and very challengingly get to a simple test. I don't know how many people had a biopsy done? Oh, quite a few, actually. Okay, so we tend to do punch biopsies, and when we talked to you before, not surprisingly, you said, can you make the biopsy as small as you can? So this is what we're doing at the moment, which is a 6 millimeter punch biopsy, and we're now trying to go down to 2 millimeters, which doesn't need a stitch, right? So if we could go from here to here, hands up if that would be an attractive proposition if we went for... Yeah, of course, it would be, wouldn't it? But I think this is really minimally invasive, and we've called it a microbiopsy. It's just a small punch biopsy, but it is, I think, much more acceptable as a potential diagnostic test than what we're starting with to do the research. And this is what we do. So we take a sample out. It's a bit like a pastry cutter. It cuts a little bit out, and then for the 6 millimeters, we do a stitch. But people are generally finding it pretty acceptable, and the stitch stays in for about 10 days. And we generally try and use the lower back as a kind of cosmetically acceptable area, which isn't too sore to have the biopsy done. There's no denying that having a biopsy is sore at the time. You have to have local anesthetic, but patients are obviously explained carefully what it entails before they sign up to the study. So this illustrates the plan, which is over 4 years. We're kind of 18 months in, and there were 2 work streams, and the idea is that this information is integrated. I think the kind of things that we're doing in themselves have partly been done before, but I think what the UK is unique in being able to deliver is a consortium that is very collaborative. People in the US said they couldn't do it because they would compete with one another. Whereas in the UK, we've got a very good consortium led by Chris Griffiths in Manchester, and we all work very closely together. And no doubt, in the end, as I've said, it won't be one element of this that brings us the test. So we're measuring antibodies, and we're measuring RNA in the skin, and we suspect together that information brought together and then integrated with are you a patient with arthritis? Did your psoriasis start at age 20 or age 50? All that will feed in to give us an algorithm. But importantly, with any test, once you develop it, you have to refine it, and you also have to validate it, because it could be wrong, and you don't want to send this as a test all across the country if in fact it is not very accurate at predicting people's outcome. So the beauty of having bad beer, and we've got a large collection of DNA in bad beer, is that we can use that to validate. So if we find HLA-CW6 predicts outcome to ustekinumab in our discovery cohort, we can go and validate it in a much larger data set. So anyone who's contributed to bad beer, it's a very important resource, and it, as well as informing about side effects, it's also helping us design these tests. So, and this illustrates how the information that we get about the signaling, so when we do the RNA-seq, we get information about these different signal pathways, how they're behaving in the skin, and we can say, okay, well this antibody adalimumab is targeting the TNF pathway. We expect those genes that are regulated by it to go down, and we expect this to alter then the inflammation in the skin, and we can use this in a very, it is very computer power dependent, and we have particular specialists called bioinformaticians who are their skill is to use all this wealth of information, bring it together, and let us understand what it means. So I've already mentioned that bad beer, we've now got 3,000 patients with DNA on, and we've already collected more than 100 patients who've given all these skin biopsies, and we've got 700 samples of serum where we can measure the antibodies to the antibody as well as the drug levels. So we've got a very rich resource that will be useful not only in this study, but it's all biobanked so we can use it in future studies if other people want to access it. So we're creating something for the future as well as for now. So I would hope that I've illustrated that we're already doing to some degree personalised medicine. I definitely think it's the way forward. It's really transformed cancer therapy. As you may know now, if you go in with certain kinds of cancer, including melanoma, they will only give you certain drugs if you have the genetic mutation in the cancer, that it means that you're very likely to respond to it. But I think people realize now, not only in psoriasis, but in other inflammatory disorders, including arthritis, that the time is right now for us to try and apply that paradigm to this situation. And it gives us a way of thinking about mechanism such that we may not only be able to predict biologic drugs, but we may be able to predict drugs like methotrexate, and we may be able to discover new drugs that weren't thought of because the pathways weren't known about. Excuse me. But ultimately, we are after more targeted and effective treatment for all of our patients. So this is an enormous team effort. As I said, I'm very privileged to come and represent the SORT consortium. But we do work well together, and I think we do work well with our partner organizations, including the Psoriasis Association. And so we hope you will be our ambassadors and talk to your colleagues and other patients in your individual areas and towns such that they can be made aware of this and that they understand the longer-term value of contributing to resources such as bad beer or SORT. So thank you very much.